I want to move on to an issue that we've been keeping our eye on for a number of months on this programme. Children under 16 who wish to undergo gender reassignment can only consent to having puberty blockers if they're able to understand the nature of the treatment, the High Court has ruled earlier today. The ruling came after Keira Bell brought legal action against the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust, which runs the UK's only gender identity development service for children. Bell, a 23-year-old woman who began taking puberty blockers when she was 16, was injected with testosterone at 17, had a mastectomy aged 20 before detransitioning. She claimed she was treated like a guinea pig at the clinic and said doctors failed to carry out proper psychiatric assessment and should have challenged her more over her decision to transition to a male as a teenager. Let's speak with Bev Jackson, co-founder of the LGB Alliance. Afternoon to you, Bev. I mean, we've talked about this
Hello, Ian.
a few times now in the kind of build-up to this. What are you making, firstly, of this ruling?
Well, first of all, I just want to applaud the bravery of Keira Bell. After all she's been through, that she was willing to go through this must have been really quite a harrowing court case. So just a tremendous admiration for her. Also admiration to the research group Transgender Trend, which worked tirelessly to produce facts and evidence which were key in this case. And I'm very pleased with the result of this case, but there are no winners here. There are still lots of very distressed children there wondering what is going to happen to them. And really what comes out of this is that what we need is evidence. We need facts. And what really, I suppose what really comes out when you read the judgment is that up to now, the people who have been particularly advocating the need for children to have puberty blockers have been arguing on the basis not really of facts and evidence at all, but really a sort of ideology. And you see that with Stonewall and with mermaids, which were unfortunately, for that reason, not allowed to intervene in this case.
And you might think, Bev, and I'm clearly misplaced in this view, but I tend to think that wherever one is in this discussion, you mentioned Stonewall and Mermaids as, two organisations that one would assume would be quite disappointed by this ruling. You might think it's just surely a reasonable, clinically measured response to, we're talking about reversing or altering somebody's gender here. This isn't about changing the colour of your hair. You might think that a process like that, puberty blockers, this is, I can barely think of anything more enormous as a decision to make. And yet it's kind of almost the severity and the seriousness that I attach to it is regularly dismissed as some kind of paranoia or ism from some of those organisations, as if people like you or I have a problem.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's just so unfortunate, because all we want is to look at the evidence and not at ideological considerations. And that's really what we're arguing for. And I think that the judgment also shows that the Tavistock Clinic was in really quite chaos. They did carry out a study from 2011 to 2015, and the results have still not been published. So they haven't been keeping records, for instance, of the age distribution of the children. I think that what we're going to see now is a more sensible approach in which people start looking at what are the facts. These children do need care, and there are a horrible long waiting list, but let them get the care they need. Let psychotherapists explore the reasons for their distress.
And one might imagine, I'm an outsider in the clinical world, but again, coming back to the enormity of this decision and the, in many cases, the irreversible nature. And whilst in the case of Keira, who is detransitioning, not before she'd already gone through a double mastectomy and all manner of other chemical issues that surround this process. So, this is very serious stuff, which is why it surprises me that it's treated by some people in a slightly more random fashion.
Well, I think unfortunately things have been told which are not true, such as puberty blockers are harmless and reversible. They're not harmless and they're not reversible. They from the moment they're taken. They do cause some effects, and the long-term effects are not even known. And then another thing is this very unfortunate false suicide statistics that are bandied about, that and I think this is so irresponsible. And what you want when you have children in distress is to find out what the causes are of their distress, and look, for instance, at online forums which have a lot of influence. Look at, as I say, organizations such as Stonewall and Mermaids that don't base their approach on science or facts, but on an ideological belief that trans children exist and must and be, and know who they are. This is what you hear. They know who they are. Well, I don't know. Anybody who's ever had a child knows that they know who they are should be taken with a bit of a pinch of salt. Children are constantly developing, and they change their view of who they are throughout their life.
And particularly with something like this, with so many influences and mixed messages and a bombardment of information, social media, various Facebook groups, you've got all manner of things going on in the mind of a 16-year-old that might just be, and we know from quite a lot of evidence, you better than I, Bev, that for many people, it's actually a sexuality issue, not a gender issue. That's just one example.
Well, I think that's a really good point, Ian. And one of the clinicians that I have spoken to at the Tavistock told me that in fact some of the intake conversations with these children never touch on issues of sexuality because it was not believed necessarily to be relevant. Now, I find that quite astonishing.
Yeah.
In many cases, it will be relevant, and we know from a recent study that homophobia is often a factor. These sorts of things need to be sorted out. We need facts and evidence and not ideology.
Bev, thank you. It's always good to get some clarity from your perspective on this. I know it's an issue you feel incredibly strongly about. Co-founder of the LGB Alliance with us on Talk Radio. I mean, we've talked about this a number of times. And what I just find utterly extraordinary, aside from, and I mean, you can get into the kind of the J.K. Rowling, status of the status of genders, the rights of women, the rights of men, etc., the rights to call yourself a woman, the rights to talk about, what you're born as is, your lifelong gender, the right to change. You can get into all of those facets and arguments about it, but I don't think you can really underplay the controversial nature of this. And if you're 14 and the idea that you might be a bit confused about something, you might be confused about your sexuality, that could be confused with gender. It might not be confused with gender. You might absolutely believe that you're in the wrong body in that respect. The idea that in 24 months, somebody is going to start hacking away at you surgically, which is possible, and you're going to be on some kind of drugs that will reverse certain parts of your development, all of these things, that has to sit surely at the very high end of what is medically controversial. But if you ideologically don't see it that way, and you're completely relaxed about the fact that gender is very fluid, it's, you could be non-binary, you could be male, female, trans, and the list goes on, and it doesn't really matter, then the idea of a 14-year-old saying, I think I'm a woman or I think I'm a guy, is in that ideological world it's not controversial, because it's your choice and you want to make that choice. And that would be fine, but I wonder whether you need a little bit more armory around you, mentally, as well as anything else, your own current situation, your simple lack of experience as a human. You might need a few more years on top of that to start to get your head around it. And that the amount of people that go through the process or begin the process and then change their mind is absolutely vast. And I think that should tell us quite a lot.